Cassandra Ellis was not the kind of woman who believed in fate. Her life had been built on structure, responsibility, and quiet perseverance. For over 3 decades, she had worked as a librarian, managing the reference desk at the Milwaukee Central Library with the same precision she applied to her finances, her home, and her emotions. After her divorce at 45, she had grown used to solitude. It was not loneliness exactly, but a controlled stillness that protected her from disappointment. Love, if it ever came again, would have to come gently. She met Jeffrey Mason on a cold Tuesday morning in February at a nondescript tax advisory office near downtown. Cassandra had come in with questions about a mortgage deduction error flagged in her annual return. She had her documents sorted by color-coded tabs, her calculator, and a mild tension behind her eyes. Jeffrey was seated 1 chair away, waiting for his appointment, casually flipping through a worn copy of Forbes. He noticed her frustration as she reread the same form, lips pressed tightly. He glanced over once, then twice, and eventually offered a quiet suggestion about a line item most filers misunderstood. Cassandra was used to men either ignoring her or over-explaining things she already knew. But this man spoke with measured confidence and a tone that neither condescended nor assumed. His observation was helpful, precise, and oddly reassuring. She looked up, met his eyes, and in that small, unremarkable exchange, something opened. A pause in her routine, a slight shift in the air. They began seeing each other in the weeks that followed, casually at first. A coffee here, a walk through the public market there. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. It was a slow rhythm built on ease and unspoken understanding. He respected her space, and she, in turn, found herself looking forward to his presence. Jeffrey had the demeanor of a man who had made mistakes, learned from them, and carried them not as burdens but as badges of survival. He was 56, a few years older than Cassandra, with silver streaks in his beard and an easy, practiced charm. She admired that he didn't try to impress her. He listened more than he talked. Over time, he began to share more about his past. He had worked in corporate finance for over 20 years, eventually burning out from the relentless pressure of managing other people's money. Now, he said, he wanted to create something smaller, more personal. He dreamed of opening a bookstore cafe in Milwaukee's historic Third Ward, a space where people could drink good coffee, read forgotten classics, and attend community events. His voice lit up when he spoke about it, not with desperation, but with conviction. Cassandra felt herself drawn in, not just by the vision, but by how clearly he had thought it through. It felt serendipitous. Books and coffee were Cassandra's deepest comforts. The idea of combining them into a physical space where she and Jeffrey could build something together stirred a quiet thrill she hadn't felt in years. He never asked her for money, not outright. He mentioned investors falling through, hinted at how close the lease negotiations were, how frustrating it was to be so near and yet financially stuck. Cassandra, ever pragmatic, ran the numbers herself. She saw potential. She saw risk. But more than that, she saw him. And for the first time in nearly a decade, she allowed herself to believe in a future that wasn't only hers. By the 6-month mark, she had begun thinking in plurals. Our space, our business, our next chapter. Her friends noticed a softness in her. She began browsing antique furniture auctions and scribbling ideas for poetry readings and author nights. She did not tell them about the money. Not yet. It wasn't a decision she made all at once. It was a quiet yielding, a slow trust built word by word, touch by touch. When she transferred the funds from her savings account, it didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like a commitment, not just to Jeffrey, but to hope itself. Jeffrey never directly asked Cassandra for the money. Instead, he created an atmosphere of inevitability. A quiet momentum built over weeks of conversations, casual updates, and shared enthusiasm for their imagined future. He spoke often of progress. Permits filed, suppliers identified, neighborhood associations contacted. He brought over color-printed charts with projections for monthly foot traffic and revenue estimates based on historical data from similar establishments in the area. He even showed her a tentative lease agreement for a corner storefront in the heart of Old Milwaukee, complete with square footage, renovation clauses, and the signature of a broker whose name she later looked up. It was all there. Detailed, polished, convincing. As a former accountant, Cassandra had spent years scrutinizing numbers for others. She knew how to read between the lines. And yet nothing about Jeffrey's documents seemed off. His spreadsheets were well formatted, his assumptions reasonable. The lease looked legitimate, the vendor lists extensive. He even showed her mock-ups of the cafe's logo, a stylized coffee cup wrapped in the silhouette of an open book, with the tagline, "Read, sip, stay." Beneath it. It was clever, charming, and oddly moving. He framed the funding as a bridge, a temporary solution to a bureaucratic delay with another investor. The amount he mentioned, $84,000, was significant, but not unreachable. It covered the lease deposit, initial build-out, and supplier pre-orders. He reassured her repeatedly, not with urgency, but with a calm sort of certainty, that the funds would only be tied up for 12 to 18 months at most. Once the cafe launched and the investors' funds cleared, he'd repay her in full, with interest if she wished. Cassandra had always been cautious with money. Her savings were the product of decades of discipline, a modest inheritance from her parents, careful budgeting, and a conservative investment portfolio. But something in her wanted to say yes. It wasn't recklessness. It was a sense of partnership, a belief that she wasn't just funding a project, but investing in a shared life. They had talked about retirement plans, maybe even marriage someday. This felt like the next step, not a risk, but a natural progression. There were no lawyers, no formal contracts, just a one-page handwritten note, signed by Jeffrey in neat cursive on a lined sheet torn from a legal pad. It read, "I, Jeffrey Mason, agree to return all funds provided by Cassandra Ellis, totaling $84,000, by December 1st, 2018. She folded it once and placed it in her file cabinet, between her will and her insurance policy. The bank transfer was quick. She stood at the teller window, heart steady, gaze focused. The banker asked if she wanted to double-check the account number, and she nodded, though she had already checked it twice. The money left her account in silence. In the days that followed, Jeffrey's tone shifted slightly. Their conversations, once meandering and warm, became efficient and clipped. He responded to her messages later than usual, citing meetings with contractors or issues with zoning permits. Their dinners became infrequent. When they did meet, he appeared distracted, always checking his phone or glancing at his watch. Cassandra noted the change, but told herself it was normal for someone managing a launch. Startups were demanding. This was part of the stress. Then came June. He told her he needed to travel to Chicago for a series of supplier meetings, including one with a specialty coffee distributor that could offer exclusive blends. He packed light, kissed her on the cheek, and promised to call once he checked in. The call never came. 2 days passed, then 5. His phone went straight to voicemail. Emails bounced back. The address he had given her for the cafe lease was empty when she visited. No signage, no renovation in progress, just a dusty, untouched storefront with a for lease sign still hanging in the window. The silence became unbearable. She went to his apartment, only to find the mailbox stuffed, lights off, no car in the lot. The neighbors hadn't seen him in a week. She left notes. Then voicemails. Then nothing. She kept telling herself there must be a reason, a delay, a misunderstanding. But deep down, a colder truth had already begun to settle. He was gone. Cassandra spent the first week oscillating between denial and desperation. Each morning, she expected a message. Each evening, she hoped for a call. When none came, she told herself there must be a rational explanation. a lost phone, a family emergency, some administrative mix-up he hadn't had time to clarify. She checked her inbox obsessively, watched the last seen status on his messaging apps, refreshed his social media profiles every hour. But nothing changed. His phone remained off. His apartment stayed dark. His online presence froze like a statue in mid-motion. She visited the cafes where they had often lingered over coffee, asking if anyone had seen him. No one had. She reached out to the few mutual acquaintances they had developed during their months together. Most were casual contacts, baristas, bookstore clerks, neighbors, and none had heard from him. His mailbox at the apartment overflowed with flyers and unpaid bills. The leasing office confirmed he had given no notice but hadn't paid rent for the month. His car, once a familiar sight in the lot, had vanished. Embarrassment took root before grief had a chance. Cassandra didn't want to tell anyone what had happened. She avoided her sister's calls, skipped Sunday lunch with her book club, and began deleting text messages without reading them. To admit she had been deceived felt worse than the loss itself. She had prided herself on being measured, sensible, impossible to manipulate. And yet, here she was, $84,000 gone, her trust dismantled, and no legal contract to protect her. Eventually, the shame turned into something heavier. Dread. She went to the police, filed a report. The officer behind the desk took down her statement, nodded politely, but offered little hope. Jeffrey Mason, they explained, was an adult, not a missing person under suspicious circumstances. The handwritten note she had given them was reviewed, scanned, and returned without comment. To the system, it was not a crime. It was a failed personal loan. No fraud, no coercion. Just another case of someone making a bad judgment call. That night, Cassandra sat at her kitchen table with the lights off, staring at the cold screen of her phone. She felt not just abandoned, but erased. The life she had imagined, coffee shop mornings, joint ownership, companionship in old age, collapsed into silence. But Cassandra was not a woman who stayed passive for long. The next morning, she opened her laptop and began searching for private investigators. She found one within the hour. Michael Greer, a retired state trooper with experience in financial fraud and domestic recovery cases. She met with him in a quiet office above a law firm, handed him a manila folder of everything she had: bank records, the note, printed screenshots of messages and images of the proposed café. He listened without judgment, nodded thoughtfully, and accepted the case. 3 weeks later, Greer called her with an update. Jeffrey had done this before, twice in other states. In both instances, he had started romantic relationships with middle-aged women, pitched vague entrepreneurial ventures, accepted funds under the promise of repayment, and disappeared. No arrests had been made. In each case, the victims lacked contracts, lacked witnesses, lacked proof of deceit. He moved frequently, used short-term rentals, and changed phone numbers often. The man Cassandra had trusted was not just a fraud. He was practiced. Greer tracked him to Indianapolis, to a modest apartment building near the edge of town. Cassandra didn't hesitate. She drove there herself, 6 hours alone on the highway with nothing but static on the radio and a racing heart. She didn't know what she expected to find. Closure, an apology, a confrontation that would restore her sense of dignity. When she knocked on the door, it opened quickly. Jeffrey stood before her in a faded t-shirt with a company logo she didn't recognize. He looked thinner, unshaven, older somehow, as if shedding identities took a physical toll. For a moment, neither of them moved. And then she understood. He wasn't surprised to see her, not shocked, not ashamed. He had done this before, and she was just another stop in his pattern. Cassandra didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't call him names or chase him down again. Instead, she filed a lawsuit. It took her nearly a month to gather everything: statements from her bank, copies of the handwritten note, screenshots of messages where Jeffrey had promised to repay the money. She included the findings from the private investigator's report: timelines, aliases, addresses, patterns. The initial reaction at the courthouse was tepid. The clerk classified it as a civil matter, a dispute between consenting adults. To them, it looked like a failed loan between former partners, not a crime. But Cassandra persisted. She submitted a formal complaint, arguing that Jeffrey had acted with deliberate intent to deceive. She included testimonies from other women the investigator had found, one in Illinois, another in Minnesota, and a third from Michigan, who declined to testify, but allowed her written account to be submitted. Each story bore eerie similarities: a romance, a business plan, a request for funding, a sudden disappearance. Cassandra's lawyer, a determined woman named Ellen Price, crafted the argument carefully. This was not a case of bad judgment. This was a pattern, and the pattern pointed to calculated fraud. After a preliminary review, the court agreed to hear the case under a charge of financial deception with intent to defraud. The judge allowed it to proceed, citing potential criminal elements masked as civil grievances. It was an uncommon decision, but Cassandra had brought more than just pain. She had brought evidence. The hearing stretched across 9 months. Delays, motions, counterclaims. Jeffrey denied everything. He claimed he had intended to build the business, that circumstances had simply changed. He argued that the women had given him money voluntarily, that relationships were emotional, and finances often became entangled. His lawyer tried to paint him as a failed entrepreneur, not a predator. But the facts spoke louder than spin. Every time Cassandra appeared in court, she wore the same dark navy blouse, the one she had worn the day she made the transfer. It became her armor, a silent declaration that she hadn't forgotten who she was or what had been taken. She sat upright, hands folded, listening to every word with composed intensity. When it was her turn to speak, she did so without theatrical emotion. She didn't cry or raise her voice. She let the facts do the damage. Her testimony detailed every step of the deception: the charts, the logo, the lease, the promises. She explained how Jeffrey never formally requested money, but instead guided her to offer it herself. She described the abrupt shift after the transfer, the missed calls, the vanishing. She outlined the journey to Indianapolis, the hollow look in his eyes, the unmistakable absence of remorse. The courtroom often fell quiet when she spoke. Her words were plain, but they struck deep. Not just because of what was said, but how. With restraint, with clarity, with the weight of someone who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to restore. 2 of the other women eventually flew in to testify. One had lost her retirement savings. Another had taken out a personal loan. Their stories aligned with Cassandra's almost verbatim. Same charm, same tactics, same betrayal. One of them broke down on the stand. Cassandra didn't. She simply watched, steady and unmoved, like someone who had already wept all her tears in private. As the trial progressed, Jeffrey's confidence eroded. He stopped making eye contact. His responses grew more defensive. The jury took note. The judge did too. Cassandra knew that justice didn't always come with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it came slowly, one documented truth at a time. She walked out of each hearing with the same posture, back straight, eyes forward. Not in triumph, but in quiet resolve. She hadn't come to punish. She had come to reveal. And in doing so, she reclaimed a part of herself no one would steal again. The courtroom was nearly silent when the verdict was read. The tension that had built over 9 months of hearings now condensed into a few still seconds. The judge's voice, steady and formal, echoed off the wooden panels as he announced the decision. Guilty on all counts of fraud, with intent to deceive. Jeffrey Mason, once a man who glided through relationships on charm and carefully rehearsed sincerity, was sentenced to 4 years in prison. In addition, the court ordered restitution, compensation to be paid to the 3 women who had come forward, including Cassandra Ellis. The moment was not cinematic. There were no gasps, no applause, just the quiet rustle of papers and the measured shuffle of attorneys gathering their belongings. Cassandra sat motionless, her hands resting in her lap. Her expression didn't change. She didn't close her eyes, didn't bow her head. She simply breathed. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was release. A slow, quiet exhale after months of holding herself together. The court document listing the restitution bore her name at the top. Cassandra Ellis, Plaintiff 1. The judge had acknowledged her persistence, her clarity, her unwillingness to let the case be reduced to a romantic dispute. That was what mattered. She had insisted on being seen not as a woman who had been fooled, but as a citizen who had been defrauded. And now, the legal system had seen her too. The compensation awarded to her was partial. $27,000, recovered from a frozen account linked to Jeffrey's previous ventures. The rest, nearly $60,000, was unlikely to ever be returned. The account was empty. The assets had been shifted. The trail went cold in offshore wires and shell company transactions. But Cassandra accepted that reality without bitterness. The money, in the end, had never been the point. What mattered was the principle, that his charm had a cost, that lies had consequences, that even someone as practiced as Jeffrey Mason could eventually be held accountable, and perhaps most of all, that Cassandra Ellis had not remained silent. She had spoken, and her voice had been heard. A few days after the verdict, a local journalist reached out. A human interest column was being written on the case, framed not as a scandal, but as a story of quiet resilience. Cassandra agreed to a brief interview. She kept it short, factual, and asked not to be portrayed as a victim. The article ran under the headline, "Woman Brings Down Serial Romance Fraudster." Below it was a photograph of Cassandra, taken on the steps of the courthouse. No makeup, no smiles. Just her in the same navy blouse, standing tall, her posture unshaken by everything she had endured. Friends clipped the article and mailed it to her with notes of admiration. Her neighbors offered supportive nods when they saw her in the grocery store. But Cassandra didn't seek validation. What she felt most was a return to herself, a grounding, a reminder that she still had agency, clarity, and strength, perhaps more now than ever before. She placed the court documents in the same folder where she had once kept the handwritten note. She tucked it away not as a wound, but as a record, a line drawn in permanent ink. Not just for what had been done to her, but for what she had done in return. She hadn't just survived. She had stood up, named what happened, and made sure the world couldn't ignore it. A full year had passed since the verdict, and Cassandra Ellis had not disappeared into bitterness or retreat. She had not locked herself away, nor allowed her experience to define her as someone broken. Instead, she quietly rebuilt. Not from rubble, but from the foundations that had always been within her: discipline, clarity, and a calm but unwavering sense of justice. After the trial, she allowed herself a short pause. A few months of long walks along Lake Michigan, evenings with novels she had once shelved for later, and mornings without urgency. But rest for Cassandra was never meant to be permanent. She needed purpose. The courtroom had given her a taste of something new: advocacy. She realized there were others, many others, who had been manipulated, defrauded, and silenced, yet didn't know where to begin seeking justice. So she enrolled in a course at a local university, focusing on consumer protection and legal literacy. It was a 6-month certificate program, modest in title but rich in content. She studied contract law, identity fraud, and the psychology of coercion with the same attentiveness she once gave to cataloging rare books. Upon completing the course, she began volunteering at a nonprofit legal center. At first, she simply organized case files and sat in on consultations. But over time, the attorneys there began to see what she carried: a deep empathy paired with first-hand experience, and an ability to explain complex legal matters in simple, grounded language. Soon she was leading educational workshops, small gatherings of women in community centers, churches, even coffee shops. The irony wasn't lost on her. She didn't tell her story often, but when she did, it was without shame. She spoke not as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror held up to those who needed it most. Her name began to circulate in quiet networks, among women who had been scammed by lovers, pressured into giving, or made to feel foolish for trusting. Letters started arriving in her mailbox and inbox, often handwritten, often trembling in tone. Some came from women in their 60s, others from recent college graduates. A few had already filed lawsuits. Others were gathering the courage to do so. Cassandra read every word. Sometimes she responded with legal resources, sometimes with a single line. "You are not alone." She didn't try to save anyone. She offered direction, not rescue. The difference mattered to her. She kept her old life simple. The same apartment, the same cat, the same friends who had gently waited for her to return. But something within her had shifted. She no longer viewed herself as a woman who had been deceived. She had become a woman who could not be deceived again. Not because she had grown cold, but because she had learned how to listen differently. To her instincts, to red flags, to the unspoken weight behind someone's words. She thought of Jeffrey sometimes, not with anger, but with distance. He wasn't a man to her anymore. He was a pattern she had interrupted, a caution she now carried in the form of knowledge, not fear. If she had once seen him as a door to a future, she now saw him as the key to her own becoming. In one of her workshops, someone once asked what justice looked like for her. Cassandra paused, then said it wasn't the trial or the partial restitution. It was this: sitting in a room with women who refused to be silenced, helping them speak in legal terms and emotional truths. She had become, in every quiet and certain way, the lawyer of her own life, and a compass for those still finding their way.